at 560theanswer.com.
This hourly segment is brought to you by Goldilocks, offering smart security systems to homes and businesses. Call Goldilocks at 708-889-5600.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. And so the big tariff case before the Supreme Court yesterday. We've been previewing for several days leading up to oral arguments yesterday. Trump had this to say about the importance of the case in an interview with Bret Baier.
I will say this. It would be devastating for our country if we lost that. Devastating. I think it's one of the most important, maybe the most, but one of the most important cases in the history of our country. I think taking tariffs away so that we can have national security. So, as an example, President Xi, he hit us with the rare earths, and I hit him with a tariff, 100% tariff on top of all the other tariffs that you're paying. And they called in 10 minutes and we made a deal.
You're saying you're happy with what you came out of it?
If I didn't have tariffs, we would right now, the entire world would be in a depression. Because, that wasn't a threat against us. That was a threat against the entire world. I did this for the world. But, yeah, I would say that I can guarantee you this, if I didn't put 100% tariff immediately on China, the entire world, because of magnets, a special kind of rare earth, et cetera, right, would be closed up. Without the benefit of tariffs, we would not. We had a very successful meeting with President Xi of China and others. And without tariffs, that would not have taken place.
Okay. Well, the world would be in a depression. That's a bit hyperbolic, I think, in addition to, a bit of a straw man argument. If Trump doesn't impose tariffs, tariffs can't be imposed, which, of course, is not true. It doesn't give him the flexibility that he wants, potentially. But the idea that it's all or nothing in terms of Trump either imposes them or nobody can, that's exactly what's being debated, is where does the president have statutory or arguably constitutional authority, but mainly statutory is the argument here, to impose tariffs at his discretion, and where is the matter one for congressional action? Some interesting exchanges worth noting. One between John Roberts and John Sauer, who is the Solicitor General for the Trump administration, on the issue of, here we go again, sort of Obamacare redux. A tax or not a tax? That is the question.
Well, yeah, foreign commerce part, but I mean, and I think this is a question for the other side as well. It's two-facing. Yes, of course, tariffs in dealings with foreign powers, but the vehicle is imposition of taxes on Americans, and that has always been the core power of Congress. So to have the president's foreign affairs power trump that basic power for Congress seems to me to kind of at least neutralize between the two powers, the executive power and the legislative power.
Let me say two things in response to that. First, the notion that the taxes are all borne by Americans and are not borne by foreign producers whose goods are imported is empirically, there's no basis for that in the record. It's actually a mix.
Well, who pays the tariffs? If a tariff is imposed on automobiles, who pays them?
Typically there'd be regardless of who the importer of record is, there'd be a contract that would go along the sort of line of transfer that would allocate the tariff, and there'd be different. Sometimes the foreign producer would pay them. Sometimes the importer would bear the cost. The importer could be an American, could be a foreign company. A lot of times it's a wholly owned American subsidiary of a foreign corporation. So it gets allocated. The empirical estimates range from like 30% to 80% of like how much is borne by Americans.
I mean, it's been suggested that the tariffs are responsible for significant reduction in our deficit. I would say that's raising revenue domestically.
There certainly is an incidental and collateral effect of the tariffs that they do raise revenue, but it's very important that they are regulatory tariffs, not revenue-raising tariffs. And the way you can see this, I think, if you look at this policy, This policy is by far the most effective if nobody ever pays the tariffs. And I say two policies, right? So if you look at the trade deficit emergency, if nobody ever pays the tariffs and instead Americans direct their consumption towards American producers and stimulate the rebuilding of our hollowed out manufacturing base, then the policy is by far the most effective. So a tariff, a regulatory tariff that...
Why not do what the statute permits? Bar importation of products altogether.
Okay, so that last piece we'll take separately, but the tariff revenue has not changed the federal debt trajectory. Just as a point of order, Tax Foundation has a pretty good analysis on that. But secondly, this argument that Sauer made about it being regulatory and not revenue generating, when they work perfectly, we would have no Americans paying taxes, which is what a tariff is, because they'd only be buying American goods. Well, in what world is that? If Americans are paying a portion of the tariff imposed, then they're paying taxes, a portion of the tax, but still a tax. And I mean, demand is never going to be perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. I mean, a little Econ 101 here. You can slap 100% tariff on French champagne, and some people are still going to pay to import it. So what what world is that he's suggesting we're going to have this status where nobody is paying the tariff because Americans are only purchasing American goods that are competing with foreign goods? I mean, it just seems to me completely implausible. Strange argument to make. But I understand he has to make the regulatory argument, not the tax argument, because taxing power is congressional. And one other exchange, now going the other direction. Brett Kavanaugh challenging Oregon Solicitor General Benjamin Gutman on one of the central statutes in this discussion, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, and asking about this alleged donut hole in the act. You just heard it mentioned at the end. The president has the power to embargo the importation of goods altogether. So if he has the power to do that, then wouldn't he have the power to do something less than that? This was the back and forth between Kavanaugh and Gutman.
Mr. Katyal referred to common sense several times, and I want to pick up on Justice Barrett's question, because your interpretation of the statute, as she pointed out, would allow the president to shut down all trade with every other country in the world, or to impose some significant quota on imports from every other country in the world, but would not allow a 1% tariff. And that leaves, in the government's words in its brief, an odd donut hole in the statute. Why would a rational Congress say, yeah, we're going to give the president the power to shut down trade? I mean, think about the effects. But you're admitting that power's in there.
Yeah.
But can't do a 1% tariff. That doesn't seem, but I want to get your answer, to have a lot of common sense behind it.
I think it absolutely does, because it's a fundamentally different power. It's not a donut hole. It's a different kind of pastry.
And on that power, that's a good one.
As Ty Webb famously said, a flute with no holes is not a flute, but a donut with no hole is Danish. Think about it. It's very Zen. But just to develop what Gutman is saying, and he does here a little bit. So he has the power, the president does, to embargo imports altogether, because that's a regulatory power. But to impose a tax is a taxing power, and that's reserved to Congress. That's the argument he makes.
On that power, though, and you've said this many times, and Mr. Katyal too, and look, I get this, obviously, but the court has repeatedly said a tariff on foreign imports is an exercise of the commerce power, not of the taxation power. And I'm repeating but John Marshall said that, and Joseph Story, and Chief Justice Hughes in the 1933 case. And we've said that quite a bit of time, which seems to at least undermine a bit your point that it's an entirely different power, because if it is foreign commerce power, it's the same power that Justice Barrett was talking about of just embargoing trade with the entire world, which you admit is in this statute.
Well, there are a couple of points in there, and I'll try to get to all of them, but I mean, I think all of us agree that context is what matters here, and that you certainly could use the word regulate to talk about a tariffing power, like you could use it to talk about a taxing power. I mean, we impose taxes for regulatory purposes as well. But the federal government hasn't identified a single other federal statute that uses the term regulate to authorize tariffs or taxes. That is just a different kind of power.
For more on this, please be joined by Professor William Jacobson, clinical professor of law and director of the Securities Law Clinic at Cornell, founder of legalinsurrection.com and president of the Legal Insurrection Foundation, as well as the Equal Protection Project. Professor Jacobson, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
Okay, so in which way were you persuaded, if you needed persuasion one way or the other, with respect to the product of the oral arguments yesterday?
Well, I think it's obviously going to be a close call. I think the various clips that are circulated, and I did listen to the over 2 hours of argument. And as with many of these arguments, depending when you listen, you could go one way or the other on how it's going to turn out. But clearly it's going to be tight. I think that nobody seems to be arguing that he did not have the power to declare this emergency. There really wasn't much, if anything, devoted to whether this is a real emergency under the statute. I mean, politically, that might be an issue, but it didn't seem to occupy anybody's attention during the oral argument. The question is going to be, is assuming he properly invoked the statute and his power, what was this? Was this taxation, in which case there's a question whether he could do it, so-called non-delegation argument that even Congress, if we're going to say Congress delegated some power to the president, it's got to be explicit and clear, and you can't just, read it into it. And if he was exercising his statutory power under the statute, is this something he could do? And I think that's a closer call than, the media I've read evaluating the oral argument is giving it, because there is a provision in the statute that gives him the power to regulate. And they spent a lot of time arguing, what does it mean to regulate importation? And the argument from John Sauer was that these are not tariffs, revenue-raising tariffs. They may incidentally raise revenue, but they're not primarily a revenue-raising tariff. They're a tool of foreign policy that he uses to beat other countries over the head. Of course, he didn't use that term, but that's the import of it. So when he's imposing these, country-by-country tariffs, he's using it to exercise the powers that he inherently has and by statute has as the president. And that's the point, that if these things are successful, and I don't think it came out probably the best way it could have during the oral argument, but if these things are successful, they won't continue. So if he imposes a massive tariff on China so that they start releasing, rare earth minerals, that's a policy tool. So that's the whole thing. Is this a normal tariff? Is this a revenue-raising tariff, which would be a tax? Or is this a tool that he is using under his inherent authority as president, but also his authority under this statute to achieve other means that have nothing to do with revenue raising? And there was a lot of argument. Well, what if he just imposed fees? Don't call it a tariff, call it fees. And everybody seemed to concede that, yeah, he could do it by charging fees to import, but don't call them tariffs. So I think this is a lot closer. And, you brought up the Obamacare decision, given that John Roberts found that
the individual mandate was a tax, right?
Tax. I guess he's going to find this is a tax. So there's 4 against it. And I don't know how the others are going to go. I say there's 4 against it because the 3 liberals clearly are against us.
Yeah. So you mentioned something that's important as well, talking about explicit authority, and this is the question of the major questions doctrine, if you will, being applied to this case, right? Where I mean, and you can explain it, but it'd be just the idea that when you're talking about a major question of significant public concern and implication for the United States, then the conference of authority to the executive has to be made explicit by Congress.
Right. And I misspoke. I call that non-delegation. That's the, major questions doctrine. Non-delegation would be there are certain powers Congress can't even delegate to the president, like the power to declare war, although gets a little fuzzy on what's a war and what needs a declaration.
Right.
So, yes, two different issues. I misspoke on that. It's the major issues doctrine, which is that if there's something that has, I forget what the exact definition is, but call it societal impact, broad societal impact. You can't read that into congressional language. It's got to be explicit. It's got to be very clear. It's got to be well defined. And that grew out of really the expansion of the federal bureaucracy and attempts to rein it in, where they would read things into a statute and say, we can do this now. So, yeah, those are two different issues. I don't think the case is going to turn on either of those. I think the case is going to turn on whether this is a tax and whether falls under the regulation of imports, which Congress has given to the president. And there's a whole issue, as your clip mentioned, but there was a lot more argument about it, you're telling us he can shut down trade completely, and nobody disputed that. But he can't impose a 1% tariff as a tool to achieve whatever his foreign policy goals are. And there was a lot of argument about that, and that's the whole donut hole thing.
Yeah,
which was a little cute, and the lawyer for the states had a nice comeback. It's a different type of pastry or whatever he said. But that, putting that little wordplay aside, does it make any sense that you would give the president power to completely shut off trade with the world, okay? But you're not going to give him the power as a foreign policy tool to impose a 1% tariff, and 1% was not what he's doing, but it was the example used, I think it was by Kavanaugh or somebody else. And does that make any sense whatsoever? Isn't that included under the definition of regulate import that he has the power to do? And so, and one of the justices, I forget which one, maybe it was Kavanaugh, said, so you're telling us that if he's in a meeting with his senior advisors, defining what he's going to do on foreign policy, and there's a threat that he has declared, and that his advisors have to tell him, oh, Mr. President, you can completely shut down trade with China, but better not impose a 1% tariff because that's illegal. Does that make any sense? Because when you read statutes, you're supposed to read them to be consistent and to make sense, basically. And does that make any sense that Congress would do that? And so I think this is a much closer call than the media coverage is giving it credit for, because most of the media coverage just doesn't like the policy, and that's a different issue. Okay.
Well, I don't even know that they don't. I don't even know that they don't like the policy. They just don't like the policy maker. I think if this was Biden doing it, they wouldn't care. But here's the other thing though too, is that there are other powers, statutory powers the president has with respect to trade and the imposition of tariffs, but they're not the immediate snapback that the president wants. So, for example, this was talked about too, the Trade Expansion Act of 62 under Kennedy, Section 232. The president can impose tariffs or imports for national security reasons, but it requires a DOC investigation to substantiate the need. The Trade Act of 1974, statutory tariffs or imports from countries engaging in unfair trade practices, which clearly you could make a strong case for that applies to China, but that requires an investigation from the U.S. Trade Rep's office. So part of this is the distribution of power. Part of it is the immediacy with which the president can take action. He has these other statutory powers that could probably serve the same interests he is trying to serve with these policies, but it would require more bureaucratic wrangling than he's, otherwise inclined to want to do if he doesn't have to.
Yeah, well, and it would be very interesting, and it did come up at one point during the argument, this issue, well, there's other authority for him to do these things, which
right.
he didn't invoke. And, if John Roberts, is true, he would, like he searched for a way to save Obamacare, is he going to search for a way to save what Trump is doing by finding other statutory authority, even if it wasn't the centerpiece of the lawsuit? And that's going to be interesting.
Right. I mean, and with respect to the aspect of like whether or not this is a revenue generator, I mean, it's there's a lot of things that are sort of, run a little bit counterintuitive if you're trying to apply common sense. You're saying something that's generating revenue is not a revenue generator. I mean, it's generated revenue. Amy Coney Barrett asked the question about how, essentially to Neil Cattell, how difficult it would be to essentially refund the monies collected to the appropriate parties if these tariffs were reversed. And he basically said, it might be a little complicated. I actually don't think it would be that complicated because I think the tariffs imposed are all like, under the IEEPA. And so it would be pretty easy in terms of looking at the coding and rebating the monies. But the point is to say, like, a tax is not a tax, and a revenue generating tax is not really generating revenue. And you can do, you can go full Monty, but you can't, take your socks off with respect to what we were talking about before, stop trade altogether, but not impose a fee on. So, I mean, there's just so many contradiction in terms, in part because it seems like some of the statutory language is at odds with itself, as well as Supreme Court precedent in these cases that still need some divination, if you will, as you sort of heard Brett Kavanaugh going through with that Oregon Solicitor General. Yeah.
I mean, I think that it's going to be close, and I think if Trump's going to lose, it's going to be that they will find that this is not within the meaning of the term regulate, that if Congress wanted to give him the power to impose tariffs, they could have said it. And the fact that they didn't, and we're not going to read into this vague word, regulate imports, to read it as a tariff, Congress didn't say it, didn't give it to them. If they wanted to, they could have. And that's how we're going to read a statute with its plain wording. We're not going to conjure up all sorts of expansive power from a word like regulate.
Professor William Jacobson is the clinical professor of law, director of securities law clinic at Cornell, founder of legalinsurrection.com, and president of the Legal Insurrection Foundation, as well as the Equal Protection Project. Professor Jacobson, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
And Professor Jacobson, join us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
This is an urgent announcement for anyone that's $10,000 or more in debt. Before you make another minimum payment, you need to know there are special programs that can completely free you of your debt. Total Financial Freedom can help you become debt-free in months instead of years. Resolve your credit card debt, signature loans, department store cards, internet loans, and timeshares. Call now at 800-533-6605 for a free consultation. For